Hello.
Hi, Torkwase. Hi. Hi,
Hi,
everyone.
welcome to round two.
Yeah, welcome to round two. So we are on Art Matters, and I'm Hans Ulrich, and I'm so happy to be with you, Torkwase, in conversation here tonight. Thanks to Andrea Hickey and everybody else who, of course, organized tonight's talk. And all my thanks go to Arthur Jafer, because it was Arthur Jafer who, about a year and a half ago, brought us together and organized actually the first studio visit I made with you. Firstly, I hope that all of you and your friends and families are safe in this extremely challenging time. And actually, I wanted to begin by reading an extract from an extraordinary poem Anne Boyer has written, the poet, This Virus. And it has a lot to do, Torkwase, with your recent work, which has a lot to do with distance. I can drink the distance. I belong to the distance. In this poem, Anne Boyer writes, we must also engage in large-scale social distancing. The way social distancing works requires faith. We must begin to see the negative space as clearly as the positive. To know what we don't do is also brilliant and full of love. We face such a strange task here, to come together in spirit and keep a distance in body at the same time. We can do it. I'm writing this because I want the good in us to break through the layers of hateful nonsense we've been drowning in. I think we can be good, but we also must prepare for an amplification of evil's evils. The time when the invisible becomes visible is at hand. Now, end of quote. And of course, Ambraya talks about negative space that connects very much to your work also, and the links to Glisson. Can you tell us a little bit about this whole series of work you've been doing about distance, and particularly I Can Drink the Distance?
Sure. I want to back up, Hans, just for a second and note a few things before we start, just so they're on record. David Driscoll made a transition, and I want to note that all of this, the way I think and the way I structure my work has a long history of having relationships with Dr. Driscoll and his relationship to Tougaloo College, where I went. So ideas of distance and movement are really ingrained in the way I learned through the people I came in contact with. First with Betty Parker Smith, then with Johnny May Gilbert, who introduced me to David Driscoll, who then introduced me to Mary Lovelace O'Neill, who introduced me to abstraction. So my relationship with distance is very much tied to this legacy of what we inherit, what we share with each other, and how we then translate what we inherit and what we share into something that you would like to invent, and through that invention add something to the conversation that has to do with more livable futures. So my relationship with distance is both belongs to this idea of belonging to the distance, is to recognize that I belong to an ancestorship, and I belong to forms that those ancestors have developed over time. And it behooves me at this moment to really recognize Dr. Driscoll, who was my way into abstraction, which I take very, very seriously, of course. So this idea of distance has to do, of course, with that ancestorship, that's seeking a form through these histories of moving and developing geographies and creating architectures and moving through infrastructures under duress, right? So this idea of distance has to do with my desire to not think about these histories in terms of time, but think about them in terms of reaching in a distant space and in a different place, and to then pull those things together to create something new. And so then I'm this sort of newness that I'm after in both form and material and language has that history embedded in it, but I'm also thinking about that as a way to provide, share, or contribute solutions for our future. Because I'm very clear that the history of Black spatial brilliance is very much going to be tied to surviving an ecological and environmental future. So my work really is about forms that go after that kind of knowledge and go after that knowing. And they also bring me, this kind of work, it also soothes me, right, as an individual and as an artist. It soothes me to understand that that history is there and that future is there. And I'm in between working in the present, very much engaged with both.
Now that brings us, of course, to I Can Drink the Distance. And you told me that the work really brings together some of the fundamental aspects of your work. There is the curve, there is the box, there is the triangle, and or the trapezoid. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about this work, I Can Drink the Distance, because it creates a space for people to be together with distance. And I wanted to hear more.
So I Can Drink the Distance was a project I started at the Cooper Union, thinking through ideas of architecture and space, specifically as it pertains to what I call the hypershape. So this idea of the curve, the triangle, and the rectangle are very much tied to enslaved people who self-liberate, right? So Box Brown is tied to the square, Harriet Jacobs is tied to the rectangle, and Anthony Burns is tied to the curve, right? So you have a rectilinear condition and a curvilinear condition that's all historically and indelibly related to self-liberation. And these kind of geometries I put together, right? I take them, I put together, I play with them, I toss them in the air, and they land at something right now like the trapezoid. So the work in finding a kind of geometric form that also embodies those histories of self-liberation, the geography, and the architectural forms that they physically, right, in real time use to liberate. And so under that condition, I have what I'm calling the hypershape, right? So the hypershape, of course, with all of those histories of making, you create a positive space and a negative space. So all of these throughways in the work that you talk about that I think are this idea of negative space is simply a throughway, a path making, right? Creating a space out of no space, inventing a way through something to another side of something. So for me in the work, the negative space is very intentional as a space of thinking of both in this moment and a kind of future. So the forms sort of activate as a way that visitors can always embody the work and move through the work, touch the work. You know, it's architectural, so I very much invite entering the work, standing on it, and interacting with it. So I'm very much interested in using this sort of methodology of the hypershape to build architectural forms that then both have throughways that think about possibilities and forms that people can occupy. That most of the time is, you know, a very sort of compositional balance between negative space and positive space. And that happens in the sculptures and the drawings too, where there's a sense of the hypershape that shows up, right? The trapezoid, the throughways, the curves, all of those show up in both the paintings and the drawings.
So there is a hypershape, and you also talked about the Black compositional thought, BCT, which is in all these works. Can you tell us your definition of Black compositional thought?
Sure, sure. So hypershape comes out of that, right? So the idea, I'll read it more than, I thought you'd ask me this, so I wanted to get ready to to read it. Black compositional thought, BCT. This term considers how paths, throughways, architecture, objects, and geographies are composed by Black bodies and form these ideas. Also, and these forms also consider properties of energy, space, sound, and scale. And those all operate together towards the idea of liberation. So Black compositional thought considers all of these spatial histories physically, right? The architecture, the plantations, the houses, the hideaway spaces, the crawlways, the through pathways that were made, that those things are operating and produce a kind of energy, a sound, an instance, conditions that are unmeasurable, right? So Black compositional thought argues that in all of those conditions, perception is key, right? Perception and movement and making is key. So in those conditions for Black people was a kind of compositional virtuosity, right? Having to create these conditions and move most of the time in this clandestine way towards liberation. And there's a history of Black people self-liberating. And that takes both things that you can measure and know and things that you cannot. So perceptions around our physical world, but perceptions around the imagination and freedom and space, and a lot of theoretical physics that has to do with that too, right? So that's Black compositional thought. So, sorry, yes, that's what I'm working on now. So I needed to make something from that. So Hypershape allows me to pull out Black compositional thinking, right, in a way that works for me.
And it's interesting because this afternoon I watched this extraordinary video of your conversation with Christina Sharp. And for those who haven't seen it, I urgently recommend to watch this video. It's on the Graham Foundation website, Sarah Herder's Graham Foundation. And in this conversation, it's also, you talk about this idea of composition, and you and Christina Sharp connected to care, composition and care. Can you talk a little bit about that? It seems very relevant now.
Composition and care. That was a few years ago, so I'm not sure exactly what we were talking about as a context of how it came up, but I can talk about I guess improvisationally how I feel about it now.
Yeah.
And in one way, I am very distraught around what's happening with the virus, and both that new ancestors that are coming from this virus, and an imposed distance and a condition of making, right? So as an artist, being pulled out of my studio, and for my setup, being pulled out of my studio, being sort of far away from my mother, Dr. Soyini Madison, and being sort of in the small apartment that I am in Harlem, composition as a way to keep my sort of neurological system sharp, right? And the way I care for my memory and my thinking and my relationships is very much around ways of drawing again, and producing drawings that, you know, are from memory about this spatial history. So Christina and I are very much interested in the Middle Passage, ideas of surviving the Middle Passage and moving through space that really acknowledges Black bodies and the way they move around the planet, specifically around the ocean. So those two things, like memory, history, ocean, the virus inside, for me, composition right now, working compositionally through my drawings and paintings, really allows me comfort. It keeps my memory sharp in terms of understanding there's this virus is happening under, you know, what is a huge environmental crisis. It keeps me understanding scale, right? Because being quarantined, if your brain isn't sharp, if you're not sleeping, if you're not taking care of yourself, if you're not drinking water, if you're not reminding yourself that the planet is warming, you could be in trouble, you know, after this passes. So for me, composition, making compositions, setting up compositional strategies for me in drawing keeps those things kind of relevant in my brain, because the way I understand all of these sciences, social sciences, environmental sciences, are very much tied to drawing, right? So drawing and composition as a tool to understand how these things relate in scale and proximity, in systems and things of that nature. So care for my own brain, for my own sanity, for my ability to still like be loved and present for my friends, and to remind myself, you know, how someone like David Driscoll cared for me when I was in his home, and the books that he lent me, and so I was drawing one of the books that he had lent me last time I was there. So that for me, making drawing and using composition as a way to get closer to that, to close that distance, is very important.
And we're going to talk more about also ecology in relation to I Can Drink the Distance, and we're going to talk about your Back to Earth project for the Serpentine. But before that, I wanted to ask you about another aspect that I mentioned of I Can Drink the Distance, and that's the performative dimension. Because as I said in the introduction, you know, we met thanks to Arthur Jafa, and you actually did a performance recently called I Can Drink the Distance, which involved Arthur Jafa, it involved Gaika, it involved Christina Sharp, actually, whom we just mentioned, Deja Smith, among others. Can you tell me more about I Can Drink the Distance? This Plantano scene in 2 acts, and of course it connects to many of the themes in your work. It connects also to the politics of abstraction. It brings together art, poetry, because your practice is so interdisciplinary. It really goes beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. You bring all these worlds together. Can you tell us about what happened in this performance?
Yeah, right. So Andrea Hickey and Mike Beasley invited me to make a work at Pace, and I had been wanting to work with a lot of these artists and thinkers and makers before, so it was an opportunity to sort of bring the people that I think with together. And a lot of it was around dealing or exploding the trapezoid, right? To take a form and to really explode it geometrically in space. So because Pace's gallery is a sort of narrow corridor almost, that is sort of open but closed at the same time, I Can Drink the Distance was about taking what I had developed as a hypershape and then, you know, sort of extrude it in the space. So this sort of architecture, sculpture was there, and then I invited people to respond to it, right? So I invited AJ and Christina and Dion and my collaborators, Dark Adaptive, Andres L. Hernandez and Zachary Fabry, to come and respond. And usually when I make this kind of condition, when I make a sculpture that responds to architecture, I write about it, I write prose around it, I write some poetry around it, and then I share it with my collaborators, and they decide how to respond. I think in this case, I asked AJ specifically to make the performance he did. And with Gaika, I think there was a bit more collaboration. With Christina, who of course I've been in conversation with before, I think she pulled from her upcoming text where she writes about some of my work, but I was really interested in her deep research around the Middle Passage and the counting of the ships that were built to enslave people. So her work, Christina's work, is very much both poetry and historical research and subjective and objective in this sort of powerful way. What else? So everyone came together and responded in that way. And Dion Brown take a look at the blue clerk, sorry. Andres L. Hernandez responded with drawings from the blue clerk. And Andres is again is a part of Dark Adaptive, a performance collective I started maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So Andres had responded through drawing to the blue clerk. He handed those drawings to Zachary Fabry, and then Zachary performed in the space. So these 2 acts were a form that I used to divide the 2 nights and divide the conversations and give each artist the space to work, you know, in some kind of, to a degree of autonomy. I'm sorry, also Autumn Night performed the first night as well. So it was an amalgamation of, I think, the best band I could have come up with, right? If I was to make a band in that way. And it was pretty amazing. I don't know how anyone else felt, but it was, you know, having the space to experiment with people you've been in conversation with for a long time, adding new information, inventing new kinds of conditions of response, and having all these brilliant people both work through ideas, create new ideas, and, you know, express, you know, their concerns around and with other people.
And
So
of course, it will
that's kind of what
continue.
it was.
And if we continue, I Can Drink the Distance now in our collaboration at the Serpentine, and that's
Oh,
another very interdisciplinary project called Back to Earth, which is part of a project where we invite practitioners to respond to the climate emergency, and it has a lot to do with collaborations with many other institutions. 50 artists will do 50 campaigns for Back to Earth, and it happened in the galleries, it happened on-site, off-site. It's all about sharing resources, really, to together with many other organizations to amplify these artists' campaigns and, you know, and support artists. Now, it's interesting also because, of course, your collaboration with architecture has to do with that project, because it's the first time actually that you and David Adje we collaborate, and of course, as right now it can only happen online, we will amplify the project, you know, with lots of different research aspects online. It's a project really about change. It's the idea that an exhibition can be a catalyst for change, and very much like the climate crisis itself, Back to Earth is a complex web, really, of interconnected research, of interventions, and asks questions such as what new ecosystems can foster agency within ecosystems, what kinds of resource sharing and collaborative working practices are necessary to present actually complex responses to these very complex problems the planet is facing. Can you tell us a little bit what you conceive in terms of this new iteration of I Can Drink the Distance? And maybe it would be interesting also to hear a little bit more about water, because this project has a lot to do with water. It was actually the first conversation we had. You mentioned water, and of course, Silvio Meirelles always talks about that, you know, water as being this more and more rarefied resource.
Yeah, well, I am looking forward to a new iteration of Back to Earth. I was really excited by the invitation because it gives me an opportunity to work with water, but work with ideas of liquidity, which is, I think, part of the project. The idea of liquids that are both of water from the body, and this exchange of the body liquids with oceanic liquids as we, in the history of specifically the Middle Passage, right? So how, and Christina talks about this in her book as well, as bodies are thrown overboard, are elected to be overboard rather than endure what is unknown. Bodies are now in the ocean, and the liquids from the body mixed with the water and liquids from the ocean turn into, of course, particles over time, and those particles, of course, are in a constant condition of state change just because of environment, right? And this is the idea of how science works and how biology works with the body, and now how it's working with climate and water. So to think about these things of water and climate, liquidity, the body, and Black history, I decided to really dive into deep sea mining, right? So deep sea mining is a continuation of what it means to hyper extract, right? So I'm very much interested in thinking about, you know, extraction as my ancestors were extracted from the continent, extraction as it pertains to oil and gas, and extraction now as it pertains to deep sea diving, right? And then not an extraction of oil, but an extraction of zinc and copper and cobalt. And what that does differently than you know, kind of oil extraction is really disrupts the Earth's platelets. And in my mind, learning about what that means, new ways of deep sea mining, and new kind of frontiers of energy extraction, this is the future, right? So if we're all in the condition of thinking about the future while thinking about the past, and we understand that these things are indelibly tied, specifically as we're thinking about global warming, it behooves me to think about what kinds of sediments from the transatlantic slave trade are in these bodies of water who have drifted off in this planetary condition. Now, this is an unknown. This is a part of the imagination. I don't know, but I speculate that there's a heavy presence there. So to say now that there's a new kind of, you know, using water as a superhighway, using water as a superhighway for Black bodies and all kinds of global exchange of materials, but now using it as a way to, you know, as a throughway pathway to get down to, you know, 1,000 feet below to extract these minerals. You also extract the Earth's platelets, right? So who knows what this extraction will do to platelets shifting naturally, as opposed to inducing these shifts, trying to then get under the Earth's core, which is under the ocean, to extract these minerals. So this sort of hyper extraction and this sort of hyper capitalism, and I'll say capitalocene condition, absolutely has to do, for me and my work and my research, a really deep connecting with using waters for superhighways for exploitation and degradation and death. So this water liquidity in my campaign around deep sea mining is a way to set up a rubric where I can argue that these things are connected. Well, I don't have to argue it, they are, but I can express work and make art objects that think about these things that are connected. Here we go. Now we're using this sort of this object that has a negative space, right, in it, to then dig into the ocean's core, to then put solid objects in it that become positive material. So this really violent kinds of extraction, you know, is what I'm gonna mine with this project. So it was great to work with David Adjaye and respond to his architecture, which is a curvilinear condition. So he's making, which I think is brilliant, a curvilinear condition inside a rectilinear condition, because as you know, PACE's, that gallery space is basically a square, a square. So he's putting a circle inside a square. So all I'm doing really is taking deep sea mining maps, right? And then trying to map, or I'll say I'm taking the deep sea mining maps, which would be these spaces, and I'm laying them on David's architecture. So we're creating negative space by laser cutting into these walls, an abstracted map of the mining. So I'm taking this positive rectilinear form and creating a negative space inside of it. And then on the walls, on the gallery walls themselves, I'm really pushing for paintings that are very much in my language. Lots of liquid, lots of water, lots of improvisation that then is on top of it. I create these rectilinear and curvilinear conditions. So it's a really hopefully discursive condition between water and solids and state changes and movement, and the architecture and the infrastructure that brings all of these ideas together. So, I mean, that's what I'm doing.
Thank you so much. It's brilliant. No, thank you so much. Now, we have a lot of questions which came in. I'm going to ask you some of those questions. But I have a last question, actually, again, related to interdisciplinarity. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the Winterwell's Drawing School for Environmental Justice, which is a project very dear to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the manifesto of this school, and also what it means maybe in this very current moment?
Well, you know, the Winterwell School for Environmental Liberation is a form where I can put all of the theories around Black compositional thought, where I can test, the hypershape, where I can put science around extraction, where I can think about the history of the transatlantic trade and its in condition of chattel slavery. I can do all of these things as a base, right? As a foundation. And then from that, think about what it means to understand systemic climate change and what it means to understand imagination around the future, and then invite people from their different fields and skills to take over a workshop or a class and collaborate with me with their, sort of urgent concerns. So we have scientists, we have environmentalists who specialize in anything from, I would say, space to geology. We have also people coming in who specialize in environmental, I'll say, environmental solutions. We have people coming in who are architects and artists who are thinking about how do we build new futures. So anyway, so Winterwell, it's a roving school that allows me the opportunity to work with different people, hold workshops, hold talks, produce films, produce conversations around this rubric of creativity. So Dion Brand, Mitch McEwen, Christina Sharp, we invited them to give talks, right? So at the Drawing Center, at the Graham Foundation. And then we'll turn those talks into books. So yeah, what will happen is we're creating content, I think, from these very brilliant people that then can be shared. And then Dark Adaptive will come in oftentimes during Winterwells and think through performance during this workshop. I don't do performance, I don't make performance, so I invite people who are interested in how performance works. Lisa Yini Madison, my mother, came in and gave a talk with Dark Adaptive, who's an extraordinary performance theorist, activist, artist in the world. So it just allows me, it allows me space to think the way I like to think and build knowledge that makes sense to me.
And for those of you who have dialed in later, I just wanted to reiterate that for more research about Torkwase's work, I recommend this conversation with Christina Sharp on the Graham Foundation website, which basically addresses many of the topics you've evoked tonight. Now we have lots of questions which came in, and they have a lot to do, of course, with the current moment, and we are living through, the world is living through. One question is, how can or should art and artists respond to these times? And then as a follow-up to that, can art be practical, or what is its role in these times?
What's interesting about that question is the answer is always contextual, right? So what art should be is determined by who you are, where you are, what your capacity is, what your skill is, and what you can offer. What art can do depends on how you think about art as a tool or as something else, right? So I think these questions really, it asks, what do you want to contribute? What is your position? What is your condition? Do you feel like the art of a kind of stillness and silence works, right? And what is your goal, or what is the kind of form that you're interested in and you can be critical of? So I think that, there's always a register of answer to that question, like what can art do? What should artists do? And my answer to that is always, it depends, that's a subjective condition, right? What is a kind of agency for you and your community? What is a kind of agency in your own household? Maybe you need to just keep your own mind together, or maybe your neighbor across the street who's 89 needs a box of water and a game set by the door. But understand that human beings have been fighting viruses for a long time, and there's a lot of loss around this condition. So I would I would encourage people to figure out what their capacities are and what their capabilities are and try to exhaust that condition.
Thank you. Another question which just came in is for Torkwase, what comforts you and sustains you in times like these?
What?
What comforts you and sustains you
Okay.
in times like these?
Wow. So, I mean, my family, my friends, food, conversation, my memories, drawing, but a lot of I am very much into right now environmental documentaries that have to do with the ocean, right? And things that work in a condition of sensoria that reminds me that there are large whales and there's sea mammals and there are holler monkeys and there's sloths and there's a big planet out there waiting for me to get back in it, right? And to engage in it. So understanding that and watching things and hearing things that feed that are very important to me. What is I'll say difficult is not being able to see, living in New York, is not being able to see paintings in person. Like that's shockingly fucking me up, right? It's like I can't go down the street and see, I don't know, a painting or a sculpture in a space. That's like surface, like the haptic, right? I can't see, I cannot see so readily in quarantine the history of humans and the haptic, right? So what's curing that or making me ease around that is just like drawing and using materials in my house to keep the haptic in the front of my mind. So
thank you. And I was reading today Stefan Zweig saying, that books can be company in times like these.
yeah.
So I was wondering, what are you reading at the moment?
Oh, what am I reading? I'll say well, I'm one of those people that I have to read things over and over and over again. So I'm just reading things, I guess, over again. But new, what I read most recently, I got the Art of Kamau Brathwaite, and I read this maybe 2 days ago. His conversation with Nathaniel Mackey. So this is a really amazing book in his conversation because I wanted to hear his words, right? And I wanted to hear the interviews. And so that's new that I'm reading. Oh, I just got this in the mail. Sadia Hartman. So I just got that in the mail. So I haven't cracked that open yet. But other things, same old things, Bodies of Descent, Glissant, Tituletics, Deion Brand's Ossuaries, started reading. I posted some of those today. So I don't have that's another book of poetry. So whatever, I don't have a fidelity to one or the other. I kind of move around. Like if something hits me, I'll move to something else. So, and then I'll just kind of dance around from book to book as they inform each other.
And we both, of course, have in common that we reread Edouard Glissant all the time. I have a ritual to read Edouard Glissant every day. Now,
yeah, that's good. Yeah, I did. That's good because were we talking about the abyss?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we were talking about the abyss. So sometimes when I'm reading Glissant, well, recently when I've been reading Glissant, I started making animations as a way, because I was telling you about the haptic thing. So I was like, okay, well, how can I self-assign in quarantine? So I self-assigned making animations with my phone, and so I'm doing these animations about abyss.
Can you tell us about those? Because they're very DIY. They're kind of do-it-yourself animations.
Sure, they are. I just I'm a student of Sam Messer. So Sam has been making these incredible for at least I think 2 years now, Sam, right? I'm not sure if he's on there. Anyway, so these credible stop motion animations where the drawings are amazing, the text is amazing, the drawings, he's just an amazing artist. So thinking about Sam, I was like, oh, I could download a stop motion animation. So I just take my other cell phone, which is this. I download a stop animation, and then I get a tripod, which has a little clicker. And then I make a mark, I make another mark, and I take these stills of each mark with my phone. And then I dump those in the animation app, and then I just run it through, really. And I just use what's in my house. So these animations, they're black salt animations because I was just in a bunch of salt water, diving in salt water. Anyway, so I wanted to make some saltwater drawings. So I'm making these saltwater drawings and into animations on my little desk.
And these animations are very do-it-yourself. And we wanted to talk a little bit about your instruction pieces also. Around 93, I started a project with Christian Boltanski and Bertrand Lavier, where we actually began Do It. And it's basically happened since then. There has always been a version of Do It. Many of them happened with ICI. And it's basically this idea that these instructions by artists can be interpreted in many different ways. And there it's interesting also, I think, in terms of the current moment, because many of these things have actually to do with taking us away from the screen and doing things. And it means not only doing things at home, it means also doing things for someone else, thinking what we can do in this situation right now for someone else. And so I'm very interested in reactivating right now Do It. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about your instruction work, because you have your incredible 99-second drawing project and other instruction pieces. It would be great to see that and hear about it more.
Okay, well, it just started with it started with me watching Nova on PBS, and I was just watching Nova and some environmental documentary, and I just wrote to a couple of friends, make a 99-second drawing. And the first instruction was kind of vague. Thanks, Derek Forjor. It was like kind of vague. So people were like, what? Then so I made it clearer, and then I developed it. So it's basically to make, the drawing is called 99 cents. So it's a 99-second drawing where you set up a condition where you document yourself making a drawing. And it can be a drawing in the expanded field. I think the actor sent me a drawing just of the sound that he was making. My friend Pamela Sundstrom sent me a drawing of a mask that she was making. So people have just been like sending through their cell phones these 99-second drawings. And it can be about sound, it can be about material, it can be about distance, it can be representational, it can be experimental, but it's just 99 seconds, right? And it was just a way to stay connected, to people, and thinking about what I would get as I get them in, the kind of different expressions and different instincts. And some were much about improvisation, and some were much about inclusion, and some were much about concern and preparedness, right? Because my friends know that really my work is about preparedness practices. So it was, I'll send you the text, the full text, and I'll send you some of the work that I got in from it, but it's
love to see it. Now we're getting a question which is very recurrent. It arrived 3 times already. Everybody wants to know about your background in architecture. Do you have a background in architecture?
I do not. I do not have a background in architecture at all. Everything that I know and understand about architecture was from sort of as an accident, really, because I was, my friends hate when I say this, but I was making some really uninteresting, I thought they were uninteresting paintings. And I was like, I'm going to give up painting. I don't know if it's useful. So I started, going into solar energy. And to have solar energy in an off-grid system and this was what, 10 years ago, then they weren't really making available flexible solar. So I needed a thing to put the solar array on and something to put the battery bank in. So just thinking about public use of utility and power, I ended up making something architectural because of a necessity. So I thought clean energy, free for the public, and I needed a thing called architecture to make it accessible to people. So then fast forward, I end up at I-Beam. Hi, Roddy. Everybody apply to I-Beam. It's the best support condition ever. So got a fellowship at I-Beam, and they were basically like, hey, make this solar powered roaming thing. And then I just made a studio, a sort of a roving tiny studio that was solar powered. And because I was at I-Beam, I could figure out the solar technology, but I hadn't yet figured out the architecture. So that was the thing that was kind of holding me up. So that's when I really got into architectural history and thinking about architectural drawing and architectural experimentation, and it just kind of blew my mind, right? So all of these things started coming to question. And so I started befriending architect. My partner Andre studied architecture, and I started reading and looking at so many architectural projects. So everything now is a kind of self-taught situation. So I've, architectural drawing books, history books, I mean, just a kind of diving into the importance of architecture and how it works and how it functions. So it's been a real eye-opener, and now it's very much a part of my practice. So it's been sort of directly a part of my practice for now about 5 years, so I was like, oh, okay, this architecture thing. So memories of like Elmina and castles that were built to enslave something meant something completely different, right? The box of H. Box Brown meant something completely different, right? So if I understand those, not through the lens of just me experiencing them, but architecture as an intention, a field of power, a field of construction, a field of destruction, a field of possibility, then working those things into my paintings, and then, revisiting Tony Smith, it's like, or Beverly Buchanan, it's like my brain just went kind of exploded, Richard Hunt, like, so I'm just self-teaching. I'm really just teaching myself architecture. Hopefully I can make architecture myself one day, and the kind of architecture.
And that leads me to the next question. Your future architecture, I'm very interested in your unrealized projects, because we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they publish them very regularly, but we know almost nothing about visual artists' unrealized projects. We know almost nothing about poets' unrealized projects, about novelists' unrealized projects, about scientists' unrealized projects. And of course, there's a whole range of the unbuilt, of unrealized projects. There are projects which are too big to be realized. Again, Sildo Meireles, he says there are projects which are too small to be realized. He also wanted to put, a small cube in a huge museum, which otherwise would be empty. And it took him a long time to do this project. It was too small to be realized. Then there are projects which are utopic, so they're unrealizable. There are projects which are partially realized. Then there are the projects which I call the locker projects which are somehow forgotten and can be reactivated. And then, of course, there is also censorship. There are the projects which have been censored. And I often spoke about this with Doris Lessing. And the late Doris Lessing said there is yet another category, which is self-censorship, right? There are projects which are unrealized because we haven't dared to do them. So within this whole range, very wide range of unrealized projects, I wanted to ask you to tell us maybe about one or two of your unrealized projects, dreams, utopias.
Oh, that's funny. I have an unrealized project. I'm not sure what category it would fall under. Is that okay?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Can be fluid.
Okay, great. Fluid is good. Yeah. Agility and skill. That's my sort of, anyway. Yeah. So I want to, as a public sculpture, build a piece that I'm titling Pilot. And Pilot is a character from Toni Morrison. I don't want to use that word character. Is it an entity, a being from one of Toni Morrison's novels? And Pilot, her character, has a small earring that is basically a box. And in that box is her name, Pilot, that her father has written on a piece of paper, right? Her father dies. Before he dies, he writes the baby's name on this piece of paper. And then Pilot, the entity character, wears this paper in her ear inside of a box. Mm. So my unrealized project is to make a public sculpture of that box. And I'm really, it's Song of Solomon. So I'm really interested in Pilot as a person, as a being, as an entity, and the box. And sometimes, since we're doing fluid, I'm also, as I study and read Pilot as a literary, turning point, connected with Toni Morrison. I imagine myself in that box with that piece of paper. And so conditions of scale in my imagination sort of conflate. And so, like, what would it be for me to be air in that box with the paper alongside a Pilot, swinging and moving, and it's a silver box. So one moment, in the story, it like glistens, and right before she transitions. So that's very much unrealized. I don't know if it's impossible, but it hasn't been said yes to yet, but
it's wonderful. Thank you so much for telling us about this. Absolutely wonderful. We just got in another question, which is about your quote, your famous quote about comprehending the incomprehensible. So the question which came in is if you could explain what you mean by comprehending the incomprehensible.
Wait, I'm not sure that's my quote. Is that my quote?
Yeah, you said here was an interview with Monique. You say to comprehend the incomprehensible, and let me say systemic order and industrialized white supremacy is a kind of incomprehensible condition.
Okay.
If you only focus on the narrative of the black body, we never really understand what the virus that is.
Okay, right. Okay, I needed a little context for that, because sometimes I think making something comprehensible can be a violent act, right? So I want to distinguish forcing a kind of comprehension on someone else's body for their space of representation can be a violent act. That's not what I'm talking about. This idea of the incomprehensible is a way to think about infrastructure, specifically maybe invisible infrastructure, that by design is incomprehensible in relationship to industrialized white supremacy and the extents of hypercapitalism. So there are these systems of sprawling that are almost networked, and just thinking about understanding the history and the ownership of extraction industries themselves, it's built to be incomprehensible. So the way, how do you work that out through art objects or questions, is to build systems yourself, right? That then kind of rub up against the incomprehensible that is harming you, right? Or the incomprehensible that you need to understand, and then test your system up against that one, right? And that's that's the way theoretical physics work, right? You take all of these known conditions and you put them up against something that's greatly unknown that they're trying to figure out. So you close the distance between what is incomprehensible and what is comprehensible, right? And that's a political act, right? If we're trying to figure out systems of between like the poetic and the measurable, that stops harm, you have to build, first of all, you have to make that distinction, because the idea that somebody's going to demand that they understand me or understand what I'm doing or understand my history and the cultural conditions of my people, that you demand that you understand that, is ridiculous, But on the other side, there's a kind of comprehension that is designed to keep you from resisting the very oppressive condition that makes everything intolerable. So I just want to be real clear about, sometimes comprehension is not the goal, and sometimes it very much is the goal. In the condition of, industrialized white supremacy and hypercapitalism, I want to be the one in charge of comprehensibility of my own subjective condition, and especially the condition of Black people. So it's a difference.
Thank you so much. I have one very last question, and I hope this is chapter 1 and that we can continue soon. The last question for today is the Rainer Maria Rilke question. Rilke wrote this wonderful little book, which is The Advice to a Young Poet. I realized that many young artists are actually watching you tonight and listening to you tonight. So I wanted to ask you, what would be today your advice to a young artist?
My advice to a young artist, this is going to seem real simple, but it's very true today, is to get as much sleep as possible, to clean your brain, to make sure that all of these systems don't cause you the kind of stress that shorten your life. I would say take every step that you can to fortify your immune system so that all the sort of conditions of your being is straight. And then just really take your own thoughts seriously. Like really take your own thoughts, your own subjectivities, your own skills, and your own virtuosity really seriously, and, I would say also look at as much art as you can and think about theory that speaks to your work and others' work as much as you can, and just really work hard and do something over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Torkwase, that's actually wonderful advice for all of us who have been listening to you tonight. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much, Torkwase. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.